The attic smelled of old wood and forgotten time. John Hayes knelt on the dusty floor, his knees protesting with the
How's the
familiar
dough?
ache of 60
Almost
years
ready.
lived
Just a
mostly
few more
behind a
passes.
desk.
The stew's simmering
Outside,
nicely.
the first snow of the season fell soft and silent over the farmland that had once belonged to his grandfather. The land was gone now, sold decades ago, but his mother's house still stood, and in her attic history waited. The wooden box sat beneath a wool blanket that had survived 2 world wars. John lifted it carefully, heavy, substantial. The kind of weight that comes not from mass, but from meaning. A label on top, yellowed tape barely holding red in his grandfather's careful script. For my grandson, when the time is right. Thomas Hayes, 1985. 40 years. The box had waited 40 years. John's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, a leather journal cracked and dark with age. A cookbook, pages stained with decades of use. Photographs in black and white faces he did not recognize. And a wooden spoon carved with words in a language he barely understood. Danke, GM 1945. He opened the journal to the first page. His grandfather's handwriting, strong and certain, despite the passage of time, stared back at him. December 12, 1944. Today I met 28 women who looked at me like I was going to kill them. Instead, I gave them my mama's tuna casserole. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about war, about enemies, and about what it means to be a man of God. John read those words 3 times. His grandfather, Thomas Hayes, the quiet farmer who had died when John was 20, who had never spoken much about the war, who had simply fed people every Sunday without explanation or fanfare. That man had written these words. That man had lived this story. The attic grew colder. The snow fell harder. But John kept reading, and as he did, the present dissolved. The words on the page became images. The images became memories that were not his own. And suddenly he was there. Camp Wheeler, Wisconsin, December 1944, where his grandfather learned the lesson that would echo across 80 years. Camp Wheeler, Wisconsin, December 1944. Thomas Hayes stood in the kitchen of Camp Wheeler and wondered if God had a sense of humor. Here he was, 35 years old, hands made for milking cows and driving tractors, wearing an army uniform and holding a wooden spoon instead of a rifle. Around him, industrial stoves radiated heat. Above him, pots large enough to bathe in hung from iron hooks. And before him, a mission he had neither requested nor wanted. Feed the enemy. The telegram had arrived in June. James Hayes, age 22, killed in action at Normandy Beach. Thomas's younger brother, the one with the easy smile and the terrible singing voice, the one who had volunteered because he believed in something bigger than himself. Gone. Erased. Reduced to a folded flag and a letter that began, "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret." Thomas had tried to enlist the next day. He wanted a gun. He wanted revenge. He wanted to make someone pay for James. The recruiting officer had looked at his birth certificate and shaken his head. "You're 35, son, and you're a farmer. Essential occupation. We need you feeding America, not fighting Germany." My brother died fighting Germany, and I'm sorry for that, but you're staying home. Home had felt like a prison. Every morning milking cows while James lay in foreign soil. Every evening sitting at a dinner table with an empty chair. Every Sunday going to church and hearing his mother pray for peace, while Thomas prayed for the chance to hold a weapon. Then in November, new orders arrived. Not to fight, but to cook. Camp Wheeler, Wisconsin needed kitchen staff for a new prisoner of war facility. German prisoners, women the order specified. Radio operators, clerks, auxiliary personnel captured near the Belgian border. Thomas had read those orders with something close to rage. They wanted him to feed German women while James rotted in a grave. They wanted him to use his mother's recipes, the ones James had loved, to nourish the people who had killed him. His mother had found him burning the orders in the fireplace. Mary Hayes, 60 years old and strong as iron, had pulled the papers from the flames and smoothed them flat. "Thomas," she said, her voice the one that had corrected him as a child and could still make him feel small. "You're going." "Mama, I can't feed them. Not after James." She sat beside him, took his face in her work-roughened hands, looked at him with eyes that had buried a husband and now a son, but had not yet surrendered to bitterness. "Thomas Hayes, you listen to me. Your brother died because evil men started a war. But if you let their evil make you evil, then James died for nothing. You hear me for nothing. But Mama, no buts. You go to that camp. You feed those women. You feed them like you'd feed James. Because somewhere maybe someone fed James before he died. Maybe some French woman gave him bread. Maybe some farmer gave him water. And if they did, I thank God for them. So you be that person now. You be the one who feeds, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's what good men do, Thomas. That's what my son does. Now standing in the Camp Wheeler kitchen 3 weeks later, Thomas held those words close. He had arrived to find Captain Ruth Gallagher, a former math teacher from Boston, who ran the camp with efficient compassion. Sergeant William Davis, whose younger brother had died at the Battle of the Bulge just weeks ago, and whose eyes burned with the same rage Thomas felt. Private Emmett Palmer, 19 years old, who looked at the world with the optimism of someone who had not yet lost anything that mattered. And today, in less than an hour, 28 German prisoners would arrive. Thomas had prepared his mother's tuna casserole, the dish James had requested every birthday. Canned tuna mixed with egg noodles, cream sauce, enriched with real butter, topped with breadcrumbs toasted to golden perfection. Simple, honest, filling. He had made enough to feed an army, because that was what the Geneva Convention required. Prisoners of war must receive the same rations as their captors' troops. Not survival portions, not starvation rations. Full meals, complete nutrition. But as Thomas stood over the enormous pot breathing in the scent of butter and fish, in his mother's memory, his hands shook. These women represented the machine that had killed James, and he was supposed to feed them his family's food. His mother's love made visible in cream and carbohydrate. The kitchen door swung open. Private Palmer entered, face flushed with cold. "Corporal Hayes, sir, the trucks are here. The prisoners are here." Thomas nodded, set down his spoon, straightened his uniform, and whispered a prayer he was not sure he believed. "God help me do what's right, even when I don't want to." The first meal, the mess hall felt cavernous. Long tables arranged in precise rows, windows that let in weak December light, and at one end the serving line where Thomas stood with Palmer beside him, both men watching the door. It opened. 28 women entered in single file, and Thomas felt something crack in his chest. These were not the monsters he had imagined. These were not the fanatics from propaganda posters. These were human beings who looked as though they had forgotten what it meant to be human. They wore German military uniforms, but the fabric hung loose on frames that had been starved. Their faces were hollow. Their eyes were empty. They moved with the careful slowness of people who had learned that sudden movements cost precious energy. The oldest might have been 35. The youngest looked barely out of high school. They stood in line silent, staring at the floor or the walls or anything except the men who held their fate. Thomas recognized that look. He had seen it in the eyes of cattle before slaughter. Resignation, the knowledge that pain was coming and resistance was futile. The first woman reached the serving line. She was perhaps 26 with blue eyes that had once been bright, but now held only fear. She looked at Thomas the way a mouse looks at a hawk, waiting for the strike. Thomas picked up the serving spoon, dipped it into the casserole, and deposited a portion onto her tin plate that would have fed 2 soldiers comfortably. The woman stared at the food, did not move, did not breathe. Behind her, another woman gasped. The sound broke the silence like glass shattering. Thomas gestured at the plate. "Tuna casserole," he said in English, knowing she probably did not understand. "It's good. My mama's recipe." The woman looked from the food to his face and back again. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. The third woman in line spoke. "This," she said in heavily accented English, pausing to find words. "This all for us." Thomas turned to her. She was older, perhaps 30, with the bearing of someone educated. A teacher, maybe, or a clerk. Her English was broken, but functional. "Yes, ma'am," Thomas said. "Of course, can't have you ladies going hungry." The woman translated for the others in rapid German. Thomas did not understand the words, but he understood the reaction. Disbelief, shock, and then from somewhere in the middle of the line, the sound of someone beginning to cry. Thomas looked past the serving line to the enormous pot behind him. Still half full, enough for seconds, enough for thirds if they wanted. He spoke to the translator woman. spoke slowly so she could understand. There's plenty more, if you want seconds, she translated. And 28 women who had expected cruelty received something they could not process. Generosity from the enemy, abundance where they had anticipated starvation. Thomas watched as they carried their plates to the tables, watched as they sat in silence staring at food too beautiful to believe, watched as the first woman, the one with blue eyes, finally raised a trembling fork to her lips. She took one bite, and then her face crumpled. The fork clattered to the plate. Her shoulders began to shake with sobs so deep they seemed to come from her bones. Within seconds, half the women were crying. Not quiet tears, deep, wrenching sobs, the kind that come when a dam breaks. When months or years of holding everything inside finally finds release, Thomas stood frozen. He had expected many things: suspicion, anger, silent acceptance, but not this, not grief triggered by kindness, not tears over tuna casserole. Palmer leaned close. "Corporal, what do we do?" Thomas had no answer. He could only watch as 28 women wept over the first real meal they had eaten in months, could only witness the power of a full plate to break something open that cruelty had sealed shut. One woman older than the rest stood suddenly, spoke in German. The translator woman, tears streaming down her own face, stood and translated. She says, "Thank you." She says, "We do not deserve this." She says she does not understand why you are kind to us. Thomas looked at the older woman, saw in her face his own mother, saw in her grief his own loss, saw in her confusion his own struggle to make sense of a world where brothers died and enemies wept over casseroles. He spoke to the translator. "Tell her she's a human being, and human beings deserve to eat. That's all." The translator repeated his words. The older woman sat down slowly, put her face in her hands, and wept harder. The shadow of Davis, Sergeant William Davis, watched from the back of the mess hall, and his hands curled into fists. He had seen everything: the generous portions, the tears, Hayes standing there like some kind of saint feeding the people whose countrymen had killed Billy. Billy Davis, 20 years old, dead in a foxhole in Belgium 3 weeks ago, shot through the chest by German machine gun fire while calling for his mother. And now Hayes was feeding German women Billy's food, using American supplies, acting like they deserved comfort. Davis waited until the meal ended, waited until the prisoners filed out, some still crying, most moving in a daze of disbelief. Then he approached the kitchen where Hayes and Palmer were cleaning up. "Corporal," Davis said, his voice flat and cold. "A word." Hayes looked up from the sink, nodded, wiped his hands on his apron, followed Davis into the hallway where they could speak privately. "Sergeant, don't you think you're being a little too generous with the prisoners?" Corporal Sheehan. Hayes met his eyes. "Geneva Convention says we feed them the same as our troops. That's the minimum. You're giving them seconds. You're giving them your mother's recipes. These are Germans. Hayes, these are the people who killed your brother." Something flickered across Hayes's face. Pain, maybe, or anger. But when he spoke, his voice remained steady. "I know who they are, Sergeant. I know what they represent. Do you? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're feeding them better than they fed their own civilians. It looks like you're treating the enemy like guests." Hayes took a breath, released it slowly. "My brother James died at Normandy, shot on the beach, 22 years old." Davis blinked. "I didn't know that." "No reason you would. I don't talk about it much." Hayes paused. "When he died, I wanted revenge. Wanted to kill every German I could find. Volunteered to fight. They sent me here instead." "So why are you being kind to them?" "Because if I let my pain make me cruel, then what did James die for? What did your Billy die for?" Hayes's voice cracked slightly. "They died so we could be better than the people we're fighting. They died so we could choose mercy over vengeance. At least that's what I have to believe. Otherwise, none of it means anything." Davis stared at him, wanted to argue, wanted to rage, but something in Hayes's face, some echo of his own grief, stopped him. "They don't deserve your kindness," Davis said, but the conviction had drained from his voice. "Maybe not," Hayes agreed, "but I deserve to give it. I deserve to be the man my mother raised, the man James would want me to be. And that man feeds people, even when it hurts." Davis turned and walked away. He did not trust himself to speak. The rage was still there, burning in his chest, But alongside it now was something else, something uncomfortably close to shame. The first night the barracks were cold. Grace Mitchell lay on her narrow bunk and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep, despite exhaustion that made her bones ache. Around her, the other 27 women shifted restlessly. Some whispered in German, some cried quietly. None slept. They had eaten. For the first time in 6 weeks, they had eaten until their stomachs were full. And the fullness felt strange, wrong somehow, like accepting a gift they had not earned. Grace, whispered the woman in the next bunk. Meg Cooper, former school teacher from Berlin, whose English was the best among them. Are you awake? Yes. What do you think this means? The food, the kindness. Grace turned to face her. In the darkness, she could barely make out Meg's features. I don't know. Ruth thinks it's a trick. She says they're making us comfortable, so we'll give them information. We don't have information. We're radio operators, clerks. We know nothing of value. I told her that. She says everyone knows something. She says kindness from enemies is always manipulation. Grace thought of the American corporal. Hayes, his name tag had read. The way he had looked at her, not with hatred, not even with indifference, with something almost like sorrow, as though feeding her had hurt him. I don't think it's manipulation, Grace said slowly. I think he's just doing what he believes is right. How can you know that? I can't, but I saw his face. He didn't want to be kind to us. It cost him something, but he chose it anyway. Across the room, another voice joined the conversation. Ruth Stone, 30-years-old widow of a soldier killed at Stalingrad. You're naive, Ruth said, her voice hard. Americans don't feed enemies out of goodness. They feed us because it serves them somehow. What if you're wrong? This from Helen Ward, the older woman who had cried hardest at dinner. What if they're just being decent? No one is just decent in war, Ruth said. War removes decency, reveals what people really are. Then what does it say about us? Helen's voice cracked. We served a regime that's doing terrible things. We didn't question. We didn't resist. What does that reveal about what we really are? Silence fell, heavy, suffocating. Finally, Grace spoke. It reveals that we were afraid, that we were lied to, that we're human. She paused. Just like Corporal Hayes is human, just like all of them are human. And maybe that's what this is about, remembering our humanity, theirs and ours. Pretty words, Ruth said, but I'll believe them when I see them proven. The conversation died. One by one, exhaustion claimed them. But Grace lay awake thinking about a man who had fed her his mother's recipe despite having every reason to hate her. Thinking about what that meant. Thinking about what it asked of her in return. In the kitchen, Thomas Hayes also lay awake, though he had tried to sleep. He sat at a small desk in his quarters, a single lamp illuminating the journal his mother had given him before he left Minnesota. Write things down, Thomas, she had said, so you remember, so you don't forget what matters. He picked up his pen and began to write. December 12th, 1944. Today I fed 28 German women and made them cry. I don't understand it. They're from Germany, a powerful nation. But they looked at food like they'd never seen it before. Like abundance was a miracle instead of a right. Something is very wrong here. Something bigger than this camp. Bigger than this war. And I'm starting to think the wrongness isn't on our side. Mama was right. Feeding them hurt. Every spoonful reminded me of James. But she was also right that doing it anyway was what good men do. I'm not sure I'm a good man yet, but I'm trying. Tomorrow I'll feed them again, and the day after, and the day after that. Not because they deserve it, not because as I want to, but because it's right. And right is the only compass I have left. He closed the journal, turned off the lamp, and prayed for strength to do tomorrow what had nearly broken him today. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside Camp Wheeler, 50 souls struggled to sleep, some with rage, some with fear, some with the strange and fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the world contained more grace than they had been taught to expect. And in Minnesota, an old woman named Mary Hayes knelt beside her bed and thanked God that her son had chosen kindness over revenge. She did not know yet what fruit that choice would bear, but she trusted, she believed. And she prayed that 40 years from now, someone would find the seeds her son was planting and recognize them for what they were. the beginning of something that would not end, the first serving that would lead to countless seconds. The moment when one man's choice to do right, even when it hurt, started ripples that would cross oceans and generations. But that night, none of them knew. They only knew that tomorrow would come, that hunger would return, and that in the morning the question would be asked again. Do you want seconds? The days after that first meal settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Thomas Hayes woke each morning at 4, began preparing breakfast by 5, and watched the 28 German women file into the mess hall at 7, with faces that grew slightly less hollow each day. They no longer looked at him with fear. Now they looked with something more complicated. Confusion, perhaps, or the tentative beginning of trust. Private Palmer had taken to teaching Thomas basic German phrases during the quiet hours between meals. Guten Morgen meant good morning. Danke meant thank you. Bitte schön meant you're welcome. Simple words that created small bridges across the canyon of language and war. Thomas used them. Each morning when Grace Mitchell reached the serving line, he nodded and said, Guten Morgen. Each time she took her plate, she whispered Danke. And each time something in Thomas's chest loosened slightly, as though anger was a knot that kindness could slowly untie. Helen Ward had asked through Meg Cooper's translation if she could help in the kitchen. Thomas had checked with Captain Gallagher, who had considered the request with her characteristic practicality. If you supervise, Corporal, I see no issue. Might be good for morale. Theirs and ours. So Helen joined the kitchen detail. And Thomas discovered that baking was a language that needed no translation. Helen's hands knew dough the way his knew soil. She kneaded with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years in a bakery, and when she made spätzle, the small German egg noodles that reminded Thomas of his mother's dumplings, her face softened with something like peace. Same idea, Thomas said, pointing to his pot of American egg noodles, then to her spätzle. Different shape. Helen smiled, actually smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen on any of their faces. And in that moment, standing in a prison camp kitchen with a woman whose country had killed his brother Thomas, understood what his mother had meant. This was the work, not fighting, not killing, but finding the common ground that war tried to destroy. Sergeant Davis watched these small acts of connection with the simmering resentment of a man whose grief had nowhere safe to land. He did not interfere, did not challenge Hayes again, but his presence in the mess hall carried weight, a reminder that not everyone had chosen forgiveness, that some wounds stayed open. 3 weeks passed. November 20th arrived. Thanksgiving. Captain Gallagher made the announcement 3 days before the holiday. The 28 women gathered in the recreation hall, standing in loose formation, while Lieutenant Stone translated. Ladies, in 2 days we will celebrate Thanksgiving. It's an American tradition, a day of gratitude and feasting. You will share this meal with us. The translation sparked confusion. Meg raised her hand tentatively. Captain, forgive me. What is Thanksgiving? Gallagher smiled. It's a holiday where we give thanks for our blessings and share abundance with others. You'll eat the same meal that every American family eats. Turkey with all the fixings. Fixings, Meg translated the word into German, frowned, tried again. The other women looked equally puzzled. Traditional foods, Gallagher clarified. Stuffing, potatoes, vegetables, pâté, a feast. The word feast needed no translation. 28 faces registered disbelief bordering on fear. Feasts were traps. Abundance was followed by cruelty. This was a pattern they had learned. But 2 days later, when they entered the mess hall and saw what Thomas Hayes and his kitchen team had created, disbelief gave way to something else entirely. The serving line stretched the length of the room. 8 stations each manned by an American soldier, each offering something that should not have existed in a prison camp. Thomas stood at the first station with carving knife in hand, slicing thick pieces from golden brown turkeys that gleamed with rendered fat. The scent alone was overwhelming. Sage, butter, roasted meat, the smell of plenty in a world defined by scarcity. Palmer manned the second station, spooning out 2 types of stuffing. One American fragrant with sage, one German Helen's recipe with caraway seeds. A small gesture, a quiet acknowledgement that both cultures could share the table. Sergeant Armstrong served mashed potatoes so fluffy they looked impossible. Station 4 held sweet potatoes topped with something dark and sweet that none of the German women recognized. Station 5 offered green beans mixed with crispy onions. And at Station 6, something unexpected. Sergeant William Davis stood behind a bowl of cranberry sauce, face hard but hand steady. Thomas had not asked him to serve, had not expected him to volunteer. But there he was. When Ruth Stone, the coldest of the prisoners, reached his station, she held out her plate without looking at him. Davis spooned cranberry sauce onto it. Their eyes met. German widow and American brother mourner. Two people defined by loss recognizing each other across the divide. Ruth whispered in German, "Danke." Davis nodded stiffly, said nothing, but his jaw unclenched slightly. Thomas, watching from the carving station, felt something shift in the room. If Davis could serve, if Ruth could thank, then perhaps hatred was not inevitable. Perhaps grief could soften instead of harden. Station 7 was piled with soft white rolls, and Station 8 displayed pies. Pumpkin, apple, pecan, their crusts perfect, their fillings rich with spice and sugar. Grace was first in line. She moved forward with the mechanical precision of someone not quite believing what she saw. Thomas carved turkey and placed 3 thick slices on her plate. The juice ran clear and savory. She stared at it, did not move. "Happy Thanksgiving, Miss Mitchell," Thomas said in English. She looked up at him. Her blue eyes were wet. "Thank you," she whispered, then moved on. One by one, the women progressed through the line. One by one, their plates grew heavy with food that should not exist. And one by one, they carried their impossible bounty to the tables and sat in stunned silence. When all 28 were seated, Captain Gallagher stood. The mess hall quieted. "In America," she said, waiting for Lieutenant Stone to translate, "we begin Thanksgiving by saying what we're grateful for." Translation, pause. "Today, I'm grateful that the war in Europe is nearly over. I'm grateful that we can observe the rules of civilized warfare, even in difficult times. And I'm grateful that we can share this meal together." She sat without ceremony. The Americans began to eat, but the German women sat motionless, staring at plates they could not yet bring themselves to touch. Helen Ward was the first to break. She took 3 bites: turkey, stuffing, a spoonful of mashed potatoes. And then her fork clattered to her plate, and she began to sob. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere beyond grief. From the place where the soul recognizes what it has been denied and can no longer maintain composure. The sound spread like contagion. Within moments, half the women were crying. Sarah Bennett with her face in her hands. Dorothy Ellis with tears dripping into her cranberry sauce. Even Meg Cooper, the composed teacher, sat with her shoulders shaking silently. Ruth Stone did not cry, but her face had gone white. She stared at her plate as though it contained evidence of a crime she had not known she was committing. Thomas watched from the kitchen door. He had expected gratitude, perhaps even joy, but not this cascade of grief, not this breaking of women over abundance. Palmer stood beside him, young face troubled. "Corporal, what did we do wrong?" "Nothing, son. We did nothing wrong." "Then why are they crying?" Thomas had no answer, not yet. But watching Helen Ward weep into her hands while untouched turkey cooled on her plate, he felt the first stirrings of understanding. These women were not crying because they were unhappy. They were crying because for the first time in months, perhaps years, someone had treated them as though they mattered, as though they deserved abundance. And the weight of that recognition, after so long believing they deserved nothing, had shattered something they had been holding too tightly for too long. What Thomas did not know, could not know yet, was that in 3 weeks letters would arrive from Germany. And those letters would transform this moment from gift to curse, from blessing to burden, almost too heavy to bear. The letter, January 8, 1945. The temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. Ice crusted the windows of Camp Wheeler in patterns that looked like frozen flowers. Inside the recreation hall, Captain Gallagher stood before 28 women who had grown visibly healthier over the past month. Their cheeks had filled out. Their eyes had regained some clarity. They looked less like refugees and more like soldiers again. In her hands, Gallagher held a canvas bag stamped with the Red Cross insignia. Inside were letters. The first mail from Germany since the women's capture in November. "Ladies," Gallagher said, and Lieutenant Stone translated, "these are from your families. I know you've been waiting for word. I know this matters deeply." She began calling names. "Grace Mitchell." Grace stood on shaking legs, accepted a thin envelope, returned to her seat and held it like something sacred or dangerous. Both, perhaps. Helen Ward. Helen rose, took her letter. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped it. One by one names were called. One by one some envelopes were distributed. And when all 28 women held mail from home, they sat in silence. No one opened their letters immediately, as though they all knew on some instinctive level that what they held would change everything. Grace was the first to tear open her envelope. Thomas, watching from the hallway where he had no business being, but could not help standing, saw her face change as she read, saw color drain from her cheeks, saw her mouth open in a silent gasp. Helen read next. Her letter was shorter. She finished in 30 seconds, and then she made a sound Thomas had never heard from a human throat. Part sob, part howl, the cry of an animal in a trap. Sarah read hers and sat motionless, staring at nothing. Meg read hers and stood, abruptly walked to the window, pressed her forehead against the frozen glass. Ruth read hers and crumpled it in her fist, jaw clenched so tight Thomas could see the muscles jumping. Claire Young, the youngest, read her letter and ran from the room. Just ran without her coat out into the brutal cold. Grace dropped her own letter and followed, calling the girl's name. Thomas found them 10 minutes later. Claire was in the snow behind the barracks on her knees, retching nothing because her stomach was empty. Grace knelt beside her coat wrapped around both of them, murmuring in German, while Claire wept. Miss Mitchell, Thomas said quietly. What happened? What was in the letters? Grace looked up at him. Her face was ravaged, aged 10 years and 10 minutes. When she spoke, her English was slower than usual, as though the words cost effort to find. My mother, she said. She writes they have 150 grams of bread each day. Her neighbor's son died from malnutrition. The doctor said he was too weak to fight pneumonia. She paused, drew breath that shook. I eat more in one meal here than they eat in 1 week. Understanding hit Thomas like a fist to the sternum. The crying at Thanksgiving, the shock at seconds, the disbelief at abundance. They had known. On some level, they had known their families were starving while they were fed. But knowing as abstract and knowing as specific fact were different countries. Claire lifted her face from the snow. Her lips were blue with cold, but she did not seem to notice. My brother, she said in broken English, 14 years old. They make him soldier. Volkssturm, children and old men. He is child and they give him gun. She began to cry again. Thomas stood helpless, watching two women break under the weight of information he could neither change nor comfort. Finally, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He helped them stand, wrapped his coat around Claire's shaking shoulders, led them back inside where it was warm. But warmth could not touch the cold that had settled into their bones, the cold that came from knowing the truth, that came from understanding that every bite they took was abundance their families did not have. That evening, 6 women refused dinner. The hunger strike, Helen sat with an empty plate before her. Sarah beside her, also with empty plate. Dorothy, Martha, Elizabeth, and Anna, 6 women who had eaten nothing since the letters arrived, who sat in silent protest against an injustice they could neither name nor remedy. Thomas served beef stew that night. Rich broth, tender meat, vegetables cooked until soft. The smell filled the mess hall. But the 6 women did not move. Meg Cooper stood and translated for Helen. She says they cannot eat while their families starve. She says this is the only solidarity they can offer. Thomas looked at Helen, saw determination in her face. Also desperation. The look of someone who has found a rule to follow and will cling to it even unto death. Miss Ward, Thomas said, and Meg translated. Starving yourself doesn't help them. Helen responded in rapid German. Meg translated. But eating while they suffer is betrayal. Thomas had no answer. What could he say? That she was wrong. She was not wrong. The injustice was real. Her family was starving. She was being fed by their enemies. The moral calculus was impossible. He served the rest of the women in silence, watched as 22 ate while 6 sat with the empty plates and emptier eyes, watched as Grace Mitchell looked at her stew and then at Helen and put down her spoon. Miss Mitchell, Thomas said quietly, you need to eat. How can I, she asked. When Helen is right, when all of them are right. Because you can't help them from a grave. But Grace did not pick up her spoon again, and Thomas returned to the kitchen, feeling like he had lost some battle he had not known he was fighting. Palmer found him sitting on a stool, head in his hands. Corporal, you okay? I thought feeding them would help Emmett. I thought kindness would heal something. But all it did was give them evidence of how cruel their own country was. How do I fight that? How do I fix that? Palmer had no answer. He was 19. He knew nothing of moral complexity or impossible choices. He only knew that his corporal looked broken in a way combat could not break a man, and he did not know how to help. On the third day of the hunger strike, Claire Young collapsed. She had been part of the protest from the beginning, following Helen's lead because Helen was older and seemed certain. But Claire's body had been pushed too far. Months of starvation on the transport ship, weeks of refeeding, and now sudden deprivation again. Her system could not handle the shock. She fell while folding laundry, one moment standing, the next moment on the floor unconscious, breathing shallow and fast. Grace screamed for help. Thomas and Palmer ran from the kitchen. The camp medic, Lieutenant Foster, arrived within minutes. He checked Claire's pulse, lifted her eyelids, barked orders. Get her to the infirmary. Now. She's in shock. Nutritional collapse. They carried her on a stretcher. Thomas followed, stood outside the infirmary door while Foster worked. After 20 minutes, Foster emerged, wiping his hands. She'll live, if we can get food into her in the next 24 hours. If we can't, her organs will start failing. He looked at Thomas hard. What the hell is going on, Corporal? Why is a 19-year-old prisoner of war starving herself? Thomas explained. The letters, the guilt, the hunger strike. Foster listened and his face grew grim. That's noble and stupid in equal measure. You need to end this before we have more bodies. Help us. You're the one feeding them. You figure it out. Thomas went to the infirmary room where Claire lay on a cot, eyes open but unfocused. He pulled up a chair, sat beside her, and spoke in English he hoped she could understand. Claire, listen to me. Your family wouldn't want you to die. She turned her head slowly, focused on his face. They want you alive, to come home, to tell them what you learned here. Her eyes filled with tears. But I cannot eat when they cannot. You must eat, because if you die here from guilt, their suffering means nothing. Your survival is how you honor them. Do you understand? She stared at him, then slowly nodded. Thomas stood, went to the kitchen, returned with soup, chicken broth with egg noodles, simple, warm. He sat beside Claire and held the spoon to her lips. Eat, please. She opened her mouth, accepted the spoon, swallowed, and began to cry. But she kept eating, one spoonful at a time, until the bowl was empty and she fell into exhausted sleep. That evening, Thomas called Meg to the mess hall before dinner, asked her to gather the other 5 hunger strikers. When they assembled, he spoke and Meg translated. I understand your grief, I understand your guilt, but refusing food is not solidarity, it's suicide, and I will not allow suicide in my camp. Helen started to protest. Thomas raised his hand. Your families want you to survive, not die from guilt. Eating is not betrayal, it's responsibility, it's witness. If you die, who will tell them what you saw here? Who will tell them that Americans chose kindness? Who will carry that truth home? Meg translated. The women looked at each other, and slowly, one by one, they nodded. That night, all 28 ate, but something had broken. Thomas could see it. The easy gratitude of the early weeks was gone. Now every meal carried weight. Every bite was shadowed by knowledge of who was not eating. And the food that had seemed like blessing now felt like evidence. Proof of abundance hoarded. Proof of choices made about who deserved to eat and who deserved to starve. Thomas wrote in his journal that night. His hands shook as he formed the words. January 11th, 1945. Today, I forced a 19-year-old girl to eat soup while her family starves in Germany. I told her it was her duty to survive. But was I right? Or am I just a man who needs to believe his kindness matters? The letters from Germany showed me something I didn't want to see. That this war isn't just about armies and battles. It's about who gets to eat, who gets abundance, who gets to live. And those decisions are being made by people far from here. People who don't have to watch the consequences of their choices cry into their mashed potatoes. Mama said feed them like I'd feed James, but James is dead. And these women's families are dying. And I'm just one man with a pot of soup trying to do right in a world that's forgotten what right looks like. He closed the journal, turned off the light, and did not sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new grief, new impossible choices. But it would also bring breakfast. And Thomas Hayes would stand at his station with his serving spoon and offer seconds to women who were learning that kindness could hurt worse than cruelty. That abundance offered to you while others starve is not a blessing. It's a mirror, and what it shows is unbearable. The photographs, April 12, 1945. Spring had come to Wisconsin, but winter remained in the hearts of the 28 women who gathered in the camp library that morning. Captain Gallagher stood before them with newspapers in her hands and a heaviness in her posture that spoke of terrible knowledge about to be shared. "Ladies," she said, and waited for Lieutenant Stone to translate, "what I'm about to show you will be painful, but it is truth, and truth is necessary." She distributed the newspapers. American publications dated within the last week. The front pages showed photographs that made no sense at first. Human beings that looked like skeletons wrapped in skin. Piles of bodies stacked like cordwood. Survivors with eyes that held horrors beyond language. The headlines read, "Nazi death camps liberated." Bergen-Belsen reveals systematic murder. Dachau evidence of genocide. Grace took a newspaper with trembling hands, looked at the first photograph, and felt the world tilt. These were not soldiers killed in battle. These were civilians, murdered deliberately, starved intentionally. The caption said prisoners had received 200 calories per day. 200. She ate more than that in a single bread roll. Helen read the article aloud in German, her voice mechanical, each word falling like stones into still water. Systematic starvation. Deliberate deprivation. Death by hunger as policy, not as consequence of war. She stopped reading, looked up at the other women. "We complained when our rations dropped below 2,000 calories. The silence that followed held the weight of mountains. Meg stared at a photograph of children. Their arms were thinner than broom handles. Their bellies were distended with starvation. Some were dead, some were barely alive. All were evidence of a choice someone had made, that these people did not deserve food, did not deserve life, deserved only suffering and death. Dorothy ran from the library. They heard her vomiting in the hallway, the sound of a body rejecting not food but truth. The terrible understanding that she had eaten bread while these people ate grass, that she had complained about the quality of soup while these people drank water flavored with death. Ruth sat motionless for 3 hours, just sat staring at a single photograph while tears ran down her face and dripped onto the page, smudging the ink, but not erasing the image. Nothing could erase the image now. It was burned into all of them. Permanent, undeniable. That evening, Thomas served beef stew, the same generous portions he always provided. But the women moved through the serving line like ghosts. They accepted their plates with hands that shook. They sat before full bowls and could not eat. Thomas watched from the kitchen and felt helpless in a way combat could never make a man feel. He had fought hunger with food. But how did you fight knowledge? How did you feed someone whose guilt had become too heavy for their body to hold? Helen pushed her untouched stew away, stood, spoke in English that had improved dramatically over the months, but now carried devastation in every syllable. "You feed us good," she said, looking at Thomas with eyes that held accusation and gratitude in equal measure. "You feed us like people." She gestured at the newspaper on the table beside her plate, at the photographs of the camps. My country made people into skeletons, on purpose, made them eat grass while we ate bread." Her voice broke. She buried her face in her hands. "I did not know, but I should have known. I should have asked where the food went, who was hungry, why we ate when others starved." Thomas moved from behind the serving line, walked to her table, sat across from her. Palmer and Armstrong watched, uncertain whether this was allowed, whether fraternization rules were being broken. But Thomas did not care about rules. He cared about a woman who was breaking under the weight of her country's sins. "Miss Ward," he said gently, "you were lied to. Your whole country was lied to." Helen looked up at him. "Does that matter? Does being lied to make us innocent?" Thomas had no answer, because she was right. Ignorance was not the same as innocence. Not knowing was not the same as not being responsible. And the food on her plate, offered freely by enemies, made the contrast unbearable. American abundance proved that German scarcity had been a choice. That cruelty was policy. that millions had been deemed unworthy of the most basic human need. Sarah spoke from across the table. Her voice was hollow. Every time we took seconds here, we proved that food was never actually scarce. The cruelty was the point. Abundance existed. Some people were deemed unworthy of it. She looked at her bowl with something close to hatred. How do we ever eat without remembering what eating was denied to others? The confession. Hours later, when the mess hall had emptied and the camp fell into uneasy sleep, Thomas found himself unable to rest. He walked the perimeter of the camp, boots crunching in late spring snow that should have melted but lingered like the memory of winter. He found Grace sitting on a bench outside the barracks wrapped in a wool blanket staring at stars. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, "it's cold. You should be inside." "I cannot sleep when I close my eyes. I see the photographs." Thomas sat beside her, maintained respectful distance. They sat in silence for long minutes. Finally, Grace spoke. "Corporal Hayes, may I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Your brother, the one who died, did you hate us? Did you blame Germans?" Thomas had known this question would come eventually, had been dreading it, but Grace deserved truth. They all did. "Yes," he said simply, "I did." Grace turned to look at him. "When James died at Normandy, I wanted to kill every German I could find. I volunteered to fight, to get revenge." He paused. "They sent me here instead. To cook. I was so angry I wanted a gun, not a spoon. But you chose kindness anyway. My mama wrote me a letter." Thomas pulled it from his pocket. He carried it always, unfolded it carefully, read it to Grace, translating the English into simpler words she could understand. She said, "Thomas, you are angry you cannot hold a gun. But you forget. The best way to fight evil is not to become evil. It is to keep your humanity. Feed people, son, even enemies, because maybe someone somewhere fed James before he died." Grace's breath caught. "Your mama is very wise." "She is, and she was right." Thomas folded the letter, returned it to his pocket close to his heart. "Feeding you all. It healed something in me. Made James's death mean something." "How?" "Because if I can feed you women from the country that killed my brother with kindness and not hate, then James didn't die in vain. He died so we could learn that war ends, but humanity must continue." Grace reached out, touched his hand briefly, a moment of connection across the canyon of language and history and loss. "Thank you," she said, "for teaching us this, and thank you for learning it." They sat in silence again, but it was different now, not the silence of strangers, the silence of two people who had found common ground in the wasteland of war, who understood that the only way forward was together carrying the weight of what they had learned, refusing to let it crush them. Victory and goodbye, May 8th, 1945. Church bells rang across America. Victory in Europe. The war was over. In Camp Wheeler, American soldiers celebrated with shouts and embraces and tears of relief. In the barracks, 28 German women sat in silence. Their country had lost. Their families were in ruins, and they were going home to face whatever consequences awaited those who had served the losing side. Captain Gallagher called an assembly 3 days later. "Transportation will be arranged within the month. You'll be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes." She paused, her voice softened. "I know many of you are anxious about what you'll find. The Red Cross will assist in locating family members. And I want you to know that you've been model prisoners. More than that, you've been brave. Facing the truth about your country took courage." That evening, the women gathered in their barracks for what they knew would be one of their final conversations as a group. Grace stood and asked the question that had been building since the photographs arrived. "When we return, what do we tell people about this place, about how we were treated?" Sarah answered immediately, her voice carrying an edge of anger that had been absent before. "We tell the truth, that Americans fed us better than our government fed its citizens, that our enemies showed us more humanity than our leaders showed to millions." Claire shook her head, fear plain on her young face. "If we say these things, we'll be called traitors, collaborators. People won't want to hear that the enemy was kind." Helen spoke quietly. "But if we don't say it, who will? The dead cannot speak. We can." Ruth surprised them all by agreeing. "For once, I agree with the optimists. I spent these months refusing to hope, refusing to trust. And I was wrong. I won't compound that by lying when we go home. Meg stood, slipping into teacher mode. Then we must be complicated. We must carry this complexity back with us. Yes, it will be uncomfortable. Yes, people won't want to hear it. But we owe it to those who died in the camps to refuse the simple stories that made such horrors possible. Grace added her own resolution. We cannot undo what was done, cannot bring back the dead or erase our country's sins, but we can refuse to forget what we learned here, that full plates can be offered without conditions, that enemies can become human through shared meals, that abundance should never again be weaponized through its denial. Dorothy spoke last. When I cook again, every meal will be a memorial. I will feed people generously because Corporal Hayes taught me that feeding your enemy is more powerful than starving them. Agreement rippled through the room, a covenant made between women who had come as soldiers and would leave as witnesses. The departure, May 26, 1945. Trucks waited outside Camp Wheeler to carry 28 women to the train station, then to ships, then to displaced persons camps, then finally home to whatever Germany remained. Thomas prepared one final meal, not a feast. That would have been wrong, but meaningful. Tuna casserole, the dish that had started everything. Helen helped him make it one last time, her hands moving through the familiar motions with practiced ease. Corporal, she said in careful English, I will make this in Hamburg, every time I think of you. And I'll think of you every time I make spätzle, Miss Ward. The women gathered for the final meal, ate slowly as though trying to memorize the taste, to carry it with them across the ocean. Evidence that this had been real, that for 5 months they had been fed by men who had every reason to hate them but chose differently. After the meal, Thomas stood at the camp gate as they prepared to board the trucks. Captain Gallagher spoke briefly. Then, to everyone's surprise, Sergeant Davis stepped forward. He had maintained his distance for months, had never reconciled himself to kindness toward the enemy. But now he stood before the 28 women and spoke in a voice rough with emotion. When you arrived, I hated you. I won't lie about that. You represented everyone who killed my brother Billy. He paused. But I've watched you these months, seen your grief, your guilt, your courage. You are not monsters. You're just people who were lied to, who were used. His voice broke slightly. I still mourn Billy. I always will. But I don't hate you anymore. Ruth stepped forward, extended her hand. Davis took it. They shook, German woman and American soldier, both with tears in their eyes, both understanding that grief acknowledged and shared loses some of its power to destroy. Thomas embraced each woman as they boarded. Helen first. Cook with love, Miss Ward. Always with love. Sarah next. Remember that abundance is a choice. Choose wisely. Claire, who had grown stronger over the months. Be brave, little sister. Dorothy, Ruth, Martha, each one receiving a word, a touch, a moment of connection. When Grace reached him, they stood looking at each other for a long moment. So much said, so much still unsaid. Write down what you remember, Grace said. Please. The world needs to know stories like this. I promise. She handed him something. A wooden spoon she had carved in the camp workshop. Burned into it with careful precision were the words Danke, GM 1945. So you remember us. Thomas's throat closed. He could only nod. Meg was last. They had developed a friendship over the months built on shared conversations and the small intimacies of teaching each other language and recipes. Now she looked at him with something that might have been more in different circumstances. But these were the circumstances they had. War, distance, impossible futures. I'll never forget our conversations, Miss Cooper. Nor I, Corporal Hayes. They shook hands, formal, proper. But their hands lingered a moment longer than necessary. The trucks pulled away. Thomas and the other soldiers waved until the vehicles disappeared. Then they stood in silence, processing the strange grief of losing people you had never expected to care about. Palmer spoke first. Corporal, will we ever see them again? Thomas shook his head. Probably not, son, but that's okay. Some people come into your life to change you. Not to stay. They changed us. That's enough. 1965, 20 years later, David Hayes, 25 years old, and fresh from Army service pushed open the door of a small restaurant in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The sign outside read "The Bridge" in both English and German. His father had given him this address, had said simply, "If you're ever in Milwaukee, go here. Ask for Grace. Tell her I sent you." David had asked why. His father had only smiled that quiet smile and said, "You'll understand when you meet her." The restaurant was modest, warm. The menu offered German and American dishes side by side without hierarchy. Sauerbraten next to pot roast, spätzle alongside macaroni and cheese, and prominently featured Hayes family tuna casserole. A woman approached, perhaps 46 years old, with blue eyes that still held clarity despite the years. "Welcome, table for one. Actually, I'm David Hayes, Thomas Hayes' son. My father said I should visit if I was in town." Grace's face transformed. "David, little David," she laughed. "Not so little anymore. Sit, please. I'll make you something special." She disappeared into the kitchen, returned with a plate of tuna casserole, set it before him with ceremony. "Your grandmother's recipe. Your father gave it to me in 1945. David tasted it, closed his eyes. "This is exactly how Dad makes it." Grace sat across from him. "He talks about you sometimes in his letters. Says you just finished your service, that you're deciding what to do next. He told you about me. We write, have for 20 years, not often, but we write." She paused. "Your father saved my life, David. Not by feeding me, though that helped. He saved me by showing me that enemies can choose kindness." She showed him a framed photograph on the wall. 28 women and 4 American soldiers, everyone smiling despite everything. "That's me," she said, pointing to a young woman in the front. 26 years old, didn't speak English, didn't know what kindness looked like. She pointed to Thomas. "Your father, 35 years old, just lost his brother. Had every reason to hate us, but chose differently." David stared at the photograph. His father had never told him this story. Not completely, just fragments. But here was evidence, proof that Thomas Hayes had done something remarkable. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" Grace smiled. "Because real heroes don't brag about being heroic. They just do what's right and move on." She gave David something then, the wooden spoon she had carved 20 years ago. "I want you to have this, because legacy must pass to the next generation. Your father taught me to feed people, all people. Now I'm teaching you. Take this, remember what it means, and continue the work." David held the spoon, felt its weight, understood that he was being given more than wood. He was being given responsibility. Mission, purpose, 2025. In a Minnesota attic, John Hayes turned to the very last page of the journal. The handwriting here was shakier, the ink lighter. December 1985, 2 months before his grandfather died. The entry was short, direct, written for him. "I'm dying. Doctors say months, maybe weeks. I'm not afraid, but I worry about legacy. David continues Sunday dinners. Good. But what about after him? John doesn't seem interested in farm life. Chases money, success. I don't blame him. World changes. But I hope someday he understands real wealth isn't dollars. It's difference you make, meals you share, people you feed. I'm writing this for him, for John, for when he's ready. Johnny, if you're reading this, feed people, wherever you are, however you can. That's the legacy. That's what matters. One plate at a time, one person at a time. That's how you change the world. Love, Grandpa Tom." John's hands trembled. His grandfather had written this 39 years ago, had known somehow that John would lose his way, had left him a map back. "I'm sorry, Grandpa," John whispered to the empty attic. "I'm so sorry I forgot." He closed the final page of his grandfather's journal and wept. He was 60 years old, had spent 40 years chasing success in Chicago, had achieved wealth and status and everything the world said mattered. And yet he felt empty, hollow, as though he had been eating food that did not nourish. Now reading his grandfather's words, understanding the legacy he had inherited and abandoned, John felt something shift, a reorientation of priorities, a remembering of what actually mattered. He looked at the wooden spoon, at the photographs, at the cookbook stained with decades of use, and he made a decision. 3 months later, John stood in a renovated community center in Rochester, Minnesota. He had sold his Chicago condo, used the money to create this place, called it Second Serving in honor of his grandfather's famous line, "Plenty more if you want seconds." The grand opening was May 26, 2025, 80th anniversary of the day the 28 women left Camp Wheeler. John had invited everyone, veterans, homeless, refugees from Somalia, Syria, Hmong communities, rich and poor, every color, every background, all were welcome. He stood before the gathered crowd and told them about Thomas Hayes, about 28 German prisoners, about the power of a plate offered freely, about abundance shared instead of hoarded, about his grandfather's belief that feeding people was not charity but duty, not kindness but justice. "So this place," John said, "is my promise. Anyone hungry eats here, free, no judgment. Anyone lonely sits at our table. Anyone who thinks they're unworthy, we show them they are. Because that's what my grandfather taught in 1945. You are worthy, you are human, you deserve kindness." John scanned the crowd as people filled their plates. Veterans chatting with refugees, business owners sitting beside homeless men. The table he had envisioned, the one his grandfather had set every Sunday for 40 years, was finally real again. He was about to return to the kitchen when he noticed movement at the entrance. The crowd parted slightly. The door opened. A woman in a wheelchair entered, pushed by a nurse. She was impossibly old, perhaps 99. Her face was a map of years lived, but her eyes, when they found John, held recognition. "I am Claire Young," she said in English, still marked by German accent after 80 years. "I was prisoner at Camp Wheeler. Your grandfather saved my life when I was 19 and foolish and starving myself from guilt." John knelt beside her wheelchair. "Claire, from the journals." She nodded, reached out with trembling hands to touch his face. "You look like him. Same eyes, kind eyes. Would you like some tuna casserole? I made it from his recipe." "Please, I would like that very much." John served her personally. The same generous portion his grandfather would have given. Claire took one bite, closed her eyes, let tears run down her weathered face. "Tastes the same. After 80 years. Tastes like hope." Later that night, after the last guest departed, John remained in his kitchen. On the wall hung the photograph, the wooden spoon, his grandfather's journal open to the final entry. "Johnny, if you're reading this, feed people. Wherever you are, however you can. That's the legacy. That's what matters. One plate at a time, one person at a time. That's how you change the world." John picked up his own journal, brand new, unmarked. He opened to the first page and began to write. May 26, 2025. "Today I opened Second Serving. Today Claire Young, 99 years old, ate my great-grandmother's tuna casserole and cried. Today I understood what Grandpa meant. This is the work, not money, not status, but feeding people, seeing them, serving them. That's what matters. That's what lasts. And I won't forget again." He looked at the sign on his door. "Breakfast tomorrow, 7 a.m. All welcome, always free." Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season. Just like it had fallen 80 years ago when Thomas Hayes made a choice that would echo across generations. To feed enemies, to offer seconds, to prove that humanity could survive even war, even hate, even the worst that history could devise. And in that small kitchen in Rochester, Minnesota, the legacy continued. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. And right was the only compass that mattered. The wooden spoon carved with gratitude in 1945 hung on the wall, a reminder, a promise, a bridge between past and future enemy and friend, hunger and abundance. Do you want seconds? The answer always and forever was yes.